It's Wednesday, April 6, 2016, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Mike McKean and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, the NFL inks a deal to live stream Thursday night football on Twitter. How well will the micro-blogging site mix with the big game? A newspaper without a web presence. In 2016, we'll talk about a new British startup that is going low-tech, and the latest from the campaign trail on the heels of what many in the media have dubbed Donald Trump's worst week ever. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to as well, but we'll start with the Panama Papers. On Sunday, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists published a massive leak of documents, more than 11 million of them connecting the Panamanian law firm that helped create secret shell companies and offshore accounts for global power players.
Over the past 3 years, Syria's Air Force has rained death on more than 21,000 civilians. Their bodies ripped apart by exploding barrel bombs, missiles dropped on homes, businesses, bus stops, even hospitals. These war crimes have been well documented. Not so the part played by the shadowy world of offshore finance. Behind the scenes, companies using offshore tax havens were accused of supplying fuel to the Syrian Air Force. In 2014, multiple governments, including the UK and US, issued bans on doing business with these companies. But now, a new global investigation has revealed that a Panamanian firm helped these companies operate as attacks in Syria continued. That firm, Mossack Fonseca, is a key player in a sprawling, secretive industry that the world's rich and powerful use to hide assets and skirt rules by setting up front companies in far-flung jurisdictions. More than 300 journalists trawled through millions of leaked records from Mossack Fonseca to expose an alarming list of clients involved in bribery, arms deals, tax evasion, financial fraud, and drug trafficking. Behind the invoices, emails, and paper trails are real victims.
Those named in the reporting, associates of Russian President Vladimir Putin, FIFA, the president of Argentina, and then now former Prime Minister of Iceland, who resigned that position yesterday. We've talked about leaks before, about documents published by WikiLeaks, Edward Snowden. Let's put this one into perspective. How big is this, maybe compared to some of those we've seen in the past?
Well, in terms of just the sheer number of documents in the file size, it dwarfs those others. I mean, there are a couple of terabytes worth of data, many thousands of documents from just this one company. And I mean, that's the interesting part of all this. This Mossack Fonseca company in Panama, they're one of lots and lots of firms around the world that are doing the same kind of tax sheltering for people. So this is a huge data dump.
Yeah, at least from what we're reading right now, it's going to take them several years just to go through what they got from this one firm. But what it's done is it's actually opened up the possibility of leaks from other firms, including those right here in the United States. What they're saying now is that what they found so far is only 211 possible Americans who are connected to this, and they're not even quite sure about them yet because there's so many backroom deals and so many ways that you can get at this. But this is a huge haul in terms of data and information.
There is another big difference between this one and, say, WikiLeaks that you talked about before, and that's the fact that the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists, the group that kind of organize this whole thing, is saying that they don't intend to do a total dump to the public like WikiLeaks did because they don't want to ensnare innocent people in all of this. So what's going to be coming out will be decided by journalists, and it won't be all the data.
And I think the unique thing that at least I like about this is the fact that it is a consortium of journalists, and these are freelance journalists and reputable journalists from various media organizations around the world, and they're coming together and they're sharing information and they're sharing the distribution of this information in a way that doesn't quite have that sort of taint that we saw with WikiLeaks and The Guardian.
And the motivation that comes with that we always talk about, that idea of context. With these being journalists, there's that idea that perhaps there might be a little bit more context put into each one of these documents that's looked at and then therefore the information in them published.
I think it's interesting, too, that they were managed to pull together, almost 400 journalists, about 100 different news organizations. There's some really big ones globally. I mean, I think the BBC and Le Monde and The Guardian, for example. but there are not a lot of big U.S. media that are signed on. You've got Univision, you've got the McClatchy newspaper group, and then this online and cable channel, which probably if you're over the age of 35, you've never heard of, called Fusion. You don't have the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, some of these folks that do a lot of those.
Why is that?
I think a lot of it has to do with the whole competition factor. I mean, to be a part of this consortium on this particular project, you have to agree to play fair. Everyone looks at the same information. It's released at the same time. You don't have this sort of deadline, gotcha, I want to be the first to release kind of agreements and mentality going on here. So, and I think that was part of the reason why certain American news operations were not contacted or did not want to be a part of this consortium.
It was kind of vague, but the New York Times public editor, Margaret Sullivan, ran a piece because Times readers were saying, why did you play this story down? Why did you not run something on it sooner? Why didn't you have access to the content? And basically, the Times editors were basically saying, well, we didn't agree to their terms, and so we didn't get invited to have the data. The terms were basically, as Ernest laid out, you have to agree to a very strict timeline on when the stories are going to be released. Everybody gets access to everything, and that's something that a lot of competitive news organizations just aren't willing to do.
And, you know, I have to commend McClatchy for saying, hey, okay, we want to be a part of this, because I think what it does is it lends some credibility to what the consortium is putting out on a worldwide basis. When you have these national news operations that are a part of this, and this information goes out, then it's very hard for others who maybe weren't a part of the consortium to sort of say, well, what about this, or what about that, or maybe you didn't get this right. You're not seeing any of that in this. And now the New York Times and others, they're going back and they're doing their own fact checking, and what they're finding out is, hey, this is holding up.
There's clean reporting going on there.
Yeah.
So that being said, what are the next steps here? What should we expect to see? You talked about this possibly taking years to get through here. We've already seen one head of state resign over the reporting that has been done here. Other ramifications that you think might be coming down the pipe?
Well, the ICIJ says that there are going to be more stories coming out next week and the weeks after that. I think they've sent sometime in May to release the names of all the public figures that are in the database, and that will lead to more reporting. It's a huge trove to go through. And I think also sort of the next story is going to be, how big of a drop in the bucket is this? Because as I said, there are many other companies that do this. And as some of the journalists writing on it said, even though there weren't Americans, a lot of Americans involved in this, Americans don't have to be involved in these shell companies if they don't want to, because they can set them up right here in the United States. There's states like Delaware and Nevada that allow this already.
Yeah, but I think one of the things that's going to come out of this is that we've seen these types of stories before involving very, very rich. We're talking about the 0.01% people here who are involved in this. These stories have come out before, and there's been sort of a push on the part of governments to try to deal with this. I think you may see some of that same thing happen here. But I think in a larger perspective, what you see is that on a global scale, you're starting to see that people are concerned about these very rich individuals not contributing to the welfare of a global community.
And in some cases acting to the detriment of it.
Acting to the detriment of it. I mean, when you look at what happened in Iceland, this is what happened to them, because part of this is that they were really rocked by the economic crisis in 2008. And this prime minister was brought into office to try to deal with some of that. And now we find out that his wife was a part of this shell company, and he knew about it, and they all knew about it, and kept it from people in Iceland, and they had protests on a scale that they never had before.
Mike, you were talking for a minute about how one of the media organizations here in the United States that had spent time looking at this and is part of this group working on it is Fusion, and that Fusion's audience is tends to be younger, tends to be more millennial, maybe up to about 35, you had said, and asked me this morning to add a certain example of one of the sidebars that Fusion had produced. Talk about that for a second and why you think maybe people should go look at it.
Well, in fact, if you look at the very first story they did on this, I mean, it's very comprehensive, it's well written, but embedded within that story, obviously aimed at appealing to the younger audience. They had two video clips that a couple of my students pointed out to me. One is from a professional wrestler named Hillbilly Jim, and the other one is a video from a porn star named Lisa Ann, and they use them to explain to the audience how you set up these shell companies. It's a page right out of The Big Short, the movie, right? And obviously it was aimed at trying to reach a younger audience. There was also a headline on one of their sidebar stories that I just loved, which was...
When I got that email from you this morning,
Well, here it is.
I got no words. Here you go.
Watch how easy it is to start an anonymous shell company for your cat. Okay, but there was a serious story, and it's a good way to draw people into it.
But that is a way to draw in that audience that may not otherwise have a story like this be accessible to them. An audience that may not think that it would interest them or it would have an impact on them. Telling it in a way that makes it meaningful.
I thought there was another really interesting media angle to this whole thing, and that was the layers of encryption that this team of journalists had to use to try to keep this data secret. They set up a special sort of private Facebook-like system where you had to log in with 30-digit passcodes, but it was a way for all these journalists to coordinate over a year's time without the data leaking out, and yet them being able to collaborate with each other to make sure they told the stories really well.
So let's talk about another experiment in journalism. New Day is the newest publication to hit newsstands in Britain. And here's the catch. New Day is only available in print, on paper. There is no website, there's no social media presence, it's just the printed page.
Look, this isn't an idea we dreamed up overnight. This is an idea that we've been working on for over a year. It comes from deep consumer insight, talking to thousands of readers, many of whom are lapsing out of print. As you rightly point out, about 500,000 readers each year choose not to buy a newspaper, and we don't think it has to be like that if the product is right.
On this in 2016, is this a risky proposition or is it finding the new niche audience?
I think it's a risky proposition, but I also think that there is a niche audience out there. The question is, how large is that audience, and can you sustain that audience? I mean, being a person who loves to read a newspaper, I mean the physical newspaper on a daily basis, I kind of like what they're doing. Whether or not I think it's going to be sustainable over time, I'm not so sure, because once people have that device and once they move into that area, then more and more they're sort of welded to that. And so I think it's going to be very difficult for them to do that. I think it may work in metropolitan areas where you can hand it out for free and that sort of thing, but to go...
Which they are doing for a time and then slowly raising the price over time, hoping that it creates a habit and then they can get people to continue.
That's where I think they're going to have some problems.
My first reaction to this is just weird, because it goes so counter to everything that newspapers are trying to do today online. And yet it also kind of seems a little bit of back to the future for me. I mean, many years ago, this was the USA Today strategy with colorful graphics and pictures and very short stories, tight editing. And that's the kind of thing they're trying to sell, along with it being more optimistic and less partisan. Maybe in Britain there's a market for that. I don't know. But the other thing about it that was ironic to me is that one of the ways they're trying to get people to know about New Day and to subscribe is by using social media, Twitter and Facebook, and yet there's no way to refer any traffic from those sites, so they don't have many followers yet. I don't know how you make that work.
I mean, I think they're going to have to move into that direction in order to be able to keep it going, just to let people know that it's out there. I mean, but right now they're competing against Metro, they're competing against Examiner, and these are papers that when you walk outside the tube stations, they're sitting right there and you grab them. Yeah. And these are free publications, so when they start to moving toward, having people pay for it, that's where I think they're gonna have some problems. So
from one experiment to another. Maybe you heard yesterday about a deal cut between the NFL and Twitter. The microblogging site, known for its 140-character updates, is going to be the new live streaming home for Thursday Night Football. Fans will be able to watch 10 regular season games for free on their computers and mobile devices. It's an interesting deal in the sense that Twitter paid a lot less for the rights to be able to do this than many expected would happen.
Yeah, I was really surprised. I thought that they would be paying more for this, because I think Yahoo paid a considerable amount
significantly
for one game.
For one
they
game,
paid $15 million.
Yeah, and so when I saw that number, I went like, "Whoa, that's pretty low." And I wonder if this is one of those we're hedging our bets to see whether it's going to work, because I think the deal is not as long as what you would think. But one of the things also is that the NFL does continue to have that control that it likes. It has that control with CBS and NBC in how they're going to do these Thursday night games. They have the same thing with Twitter. So I think that's mainly what the NFL wanted was control. It's really going to be interesting to see whether or not they're going to reach the target audience, which they're trying to reach a younger audience, which is cut the cable cord, but they're also trying to reach an international audience, because the NFL is seriously considering putting a team in London. They're seriously considering maybe having a team in Asia and in other places. But that's where I think they're trying to find out if this Twitter thing works. Then we have the possibility of actually expanding that international audience in order to be able to have a team full time in London.
You know, and unlike a lot of media companies, the NFL is looking ahead because their contracts with the TV networks don't expire for another 5 years.
I think it's another
or something
5 years.
Like that. But they're already thinking about how they're going to reach them through alternative means, this audience. They're thinking about, how we're going to get people on mobile who want to engage with football. And one of the aspects of this deal with Twitter that I find really interesting is not necessarily that they're live streaming. I mean, anybody could do that. They could have
gone. We can do that with Periscope. We could do that with our show now if we wanted to through Twitter directly.
Yeah, but I think the control aspect was what they have here.
But my point I was going at is anybody could live stream it. But what Twitter brings to the party for the NFL is they're bringing Periscope. And so they're going to have this social interaction with players and teams before and after the games. And that's probably more valuable for both Twitter and the NFL than just the live stream itself.
Now, let me ask you if this is even a concern, or maybe I'm overthinking this, but when I think back to that game last October that was in London, that was on Yahoo, it wasn't exactly the greatest user experience for people. There was some buffering, there were problems with heavy use, and I think back and there aren't as many of these lately as there have been in the past. I think specifically to the day when Michael Jackson died, which was the first time that Twitter went down because of heavy use during breaking news. Does Twitter have to worry about an infrastructure problem with the amount of use that might be going in terms of live streaming for the length of an NFL football game? That's a good 3 hours.
I think that's one of the reasons why they're doing it on Thursday night as opposed to a Sunday game, or Sunday night game for that matter. So, or even Monday night. I think they don't get as much. They don't get as much viewership on the Thursday night game, so they're going to try it here just to see how it works. And so I think that's going to be the interesting part. But Mike, a question I have for you is that the local stations are going to lose out here because they're going to the national ads. They're going to allow the CBS and NBC national ads to play during these feeds, but it's the NFL is going to have the local time to use for their own marketing or whatever they want to use. And how's that going to impact the local stations, especially for those who don't have that?
I think it's just one more example of the decoupling of local stations from the networks, and how local stations are going to have to figure out what they offer uniquely to their audience to keep them in business, because more and more the networks' interests are divided from the local stations. I'll tell you another thing I found really interesting about this. You asked about Twitter and whether they have to worry about the technology of live streaming. I think they've got a lot to worry about. I mean, the NFL's handing them a lifeline. Twitter's growth has been stagnant for several months now. Their stock price has declined. They've got all kinds of really interesting competitors like Snapchat and Instagram and WeChat and all these other companies that can basically do what they do. And so they need to have a win, and this could be one for them.
Okay, well, while we're on the subject of the NFL, I want to talk about a story that broke last week while we were off. The league has requested that the New York Times correct a story it published about player concussions and the league's response to them. The Times story suggests that it took the same approach the NFL did to handling the concussion issues that the tobacco industry did when data showed the ill health effects of smoking. The Times is standing by its story and saying there will be no retraction, correction, or clarification coming. The NFL's letter to the Times has hinted at legal action, but experts say that's going to be a real tough go for them.
Well, they're going to have to show actual malice. I mean, this is Sullivan. And that is very hard to prove. They're going to have to prove that the NFL knowingly and maliciously,
or that the New York Times,
the New York Times
yeah.
knowingly maliciously went after the NFL in this way. And from the story that I read, I don't see that. But the fact that they've asked the NFL has asked the New York Times or requested that they hang on to their notes and all the material that they use to put the story together does lead lawyers to believe that the NFL is going to try and see if they can bring some sort of case against them.
And, the Sullivan case was the New York Times versus Sullivan. And I doubt that the New York Times is cowed by this threat of a lawsuit. I think perhaps the NFL is really making this bluff aimed at other media who might want to follow on with other tougher stories that don't have the resources of the New York Times to fight back. Now, if you read the stories, now you've got them on our links blog, there's the story, there's the NFL's reaction to it, and then there's the New York Times response. And I think if you look at that carefully, you're going to see that it was a very well documented story by a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist as a member of that team. I mean, they spelled out exactly how 100 players and their concussions were not included in the data, including people like Troy Aikman, quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys at the time. So it calls into question the statistics that they were using about concussions. And they were very careful with their linkages between the NFL and the tobacco industry. They never said that they colluded. They only said that they had people who worked for the NFL who were also working for the tobacco industry, that there was an owner of a team in the NFL who also owned part of a tobacco company. And then you let the readers draw their own inferences from that.
And I think that's where the NFL is going to have a problem trying to say that aspect of it constituted actual malice.
Okay, well, another week, another election day. Here in mid-Missouri, municipal elections, a new mayor now elected in Columbia, and in Wisconsin, primary wins for Ted Cruz and for Bernie Sanders. This is on the heels of what many in the media called the worst week ever for Republican front-runner Donald Trump. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the battery allegations against his campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski. Well, he was charged with misdemeanor battery for putting his hands on a reporter. Then there was Anderson Cooper challenging Donald Trump on his tweets about Heidi Cruz and stealing the night in that town hall, frankly, if I may say so, with what the best lines I've heard in a while, telling Trump that his argument that Cruz started it is that of a 5-year-old, only to have it blow up in Trump's face again the following night when he appeared on an MSNBC town hall with Chris Matthews and said that women who get abortions should be punished. Put that all together, and yes, it is a pretty bad week. Maybe even the worst ever. And by the end of it, Donald Trump had to do something. So he sat down for an interview with the Washington Post's Bob Woodward and Robert Costa. Listen to them describe parts of their conversation.
You asked the question about,
are you the Lone Ranger? Because that's what I kept hearing from him, whether it was foreign policy and his view of non-intervention, whether it was Wall Street, I don't need them. He is someone who has charisma, has political charm, but is in many ways an isolated figure by choice.
yes, and he feels, and he talked at length about this, you've got to win. You've got to win. Primaries are not over, which is quite true. I mean, he could win, and maybe he won't win, but he's got to, he said, you need to break eggs, and there are 2 eggs left, namely Governor Kasich and Ted Cruz, and then he'll move into this accommodating mode. And what we were asking him politically, is this possibly too late? I mean, have you alienated so many people that you can't bring them back?
The way he speaks, there's sometimes a slight bit of menace with a phrase like breaking the eggs. It's not just about beating an opponent, it's about breaking the egg.
So apparently what we've seen for the last 8 months was all part of a strategy to break the egg and then move to the center.
I don't know about that. I mean, he broke another egg last night when he could have given at least a semi-gracious concession speech when he was beaten soundly by Ted Cruz in Wisconsin, and instead he calls him a puppet, basically, of the Republican establishment, a Trojan horse, and, you know, that's breaking some eggs that I don't think he's going to be able to put back together again. And when you think about this, if he does not get the number of delegates that he needs going into that convention, it's pretty clear now that he's not going to get them.
Yeah, I think the Wisconsin primary and what happened there with Ted Cruz's huge margin of victory pretty much seals the deal for a brokered convention for the Republicans, which is something that they desperately don't need, because they need to figure out a way to start changing the narrative. Because right now, I think it was a story that came out on the Associated Press last week, under every single polling model that has been done by numerous organizations, either Donald Trump loses to Hillary Clinton by an astounding margin. So I think they're really concerned about that.
I mean, all of that can change, but one of the things I've sensed now is that the news media feel like maybe it's time to pile on, because there's been so many predictions about how Trump was going to fall, and he never did, made us all look kind of silly. But now with what happened in Wisconsin, with the concerted advertising effort by the anti-Trump super PACs and all of that, it's beginning to look like, it's okay to say, to frame the story that the anti-Trump formula is working. And God knows, journalists of all stripes, we all would love to have an open or brokered convention. That would be the news story of the decade.
We might actually see more than 1 or 2 nights of the convention televised on network television again.
Yeah, man, we haven't seen that in
decades.
I think 3 cycles now. So it's going to be very interesting. I mean, instead of having that little 1-hour window, we could have the entire thing, because you're going to have this back and forth infighting, and who knows what either Cruz or Trump will say or will do, or their allies will do at a convention like that.
The other thing about that Bob Woodward conversation with Trump is that it shows that this whole unorthodox campaign, no matter what he says, whether he's saying things about women, whether he's saying that we should allow the Koreans and the Japanese to have their own nuclear weapons, whatever it is, it's all Trump making these decisions. It doesn't sound like, from the interviews, that there's anybody on his campaign that can convince him to be more presidential. Trump decides what he's going to say on the spur of the moment, and he says it. Okay, well, before we go, there are a couple of things that we want to make sure we're telling you about. First of all, if you wanted to see Spike Lee's documentary short that he produced on Concerned Student 1950 while he was in town during the True False Film Festival, that screens tonight at 8 p.m. at the Missouri Theater. So there's still some time for you to get down there and check that out. It's free and open to the public. And a big congratulations to Ernest. You might have actually seen him on the news and in the papers this week. One of the 5 recipients of this year's William T. Kemper Fellowship. So congratulations to you. And to be sitting at a table now with 2 Kemper Fellows is a huge honor for me. So congratulations to you.
Glad to be a member of the club.
Okay, well, that music means we're pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about today on our links blog. It's under the Programs tab at kbia.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave us comments or questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show. Maya Jackson is our technical producer, and Pat Akers ran our audio. Chelsea Vaughn is our associate producer, and I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.